God, the last time I saw a room as crowded as this, it was at Balmoral Surgery, so... sorry, Dr. Sparrow's not there, is it? Right, okay. You're probably wondering why someone would be interested in a serial killer. So I hope I'm fairly normal, but the reason why I'm particularly interested in Jack the Ripper is because it is unquestionably the greatest criminal whodunit in history, okay? Even today, books are being published. Tonight, someone is researching somewhere some long-forgotten piece of information about the crimes in the hope of exposing the Ripper. The second reason why I'm interested in it is because I was actually born... You can't really see it, but there should be a blue plaque, one day there will be, in Worcester Road, which is... If not quite in Ripper country, we moved to Bethnal Green. And when I was a little boy, you could walk down Bethnal Green Road, turn left into Brick Lane, and then you'd be at Hanbury Street, and you'd be in Ripper country, which at that time was basically as it was at the time of the crimes. So, the final reason why I'm particularly interested in Jack the Ripper is, like everybody else that's ever studied the subject, you hope one day to be able to identify him. Now, exclusively, I can reveal tonight that towards the end of this presentation, you may very well find out who I think Jack the Ripper is. That doesn't necessarily mean it was him. So if I could have the next slide, please. So, we're going to look at the background to the Ripper murders. Look at the murders themselves. There are some very grainy police photographs of the murders, particularly mortuary scenes afterwards. They're okay, it's part of the history of Jack the Ripper. There's one later on which is particularly gruesome, which is the last murder. So if anybody's of a nervous disposition, tough luck, okay? And then I'm going to look at things like the evidence surrounding it, why I believe Jack was never uncovered deliberately, and look at probably over time the top three suspects, number 1s, 2 and 3. So if I can have the next slide then, please. So this year, or more precisely autumn, marks the 130th anniversary of a series of murders at London East End. It's believed that the murders were committed by one man, i.e. Jack the Ripper, and that no one was ever charged with it, so it remains the greatest unsolved criminal case in history. Next slide, please. So, before we look at Jack and what he got up to, you need to understand the East End in the 1880s when the murders took place. During the 19th century, London was transformed into the world's biggest city and capital of the biggest empire the world had ever seen, the British Empire. Its population expanded from 1 million in 1800 to nearly 7 million just over 100 years later. Imagine that, 7-fold increase in its population. And there was incredible poverty in the richest city of the world. These murders took place in what you would now call E1, E2, and one in the City of London. A mile away from where these murders took place, or mostly where they took place, the Lord Mayor of London lived. There was incredible wealth living alongside incredible poverty. Life expectancy for a child born into a poor working class home was probably in the 30s, or you're lucky if you lived to be 30 or 40. 1 in 4 children were dying of disease. So incredible poverty in the world's richest city. And of course, the backdrop to this was that the workhouses existed and they were feared and hated by the poor. The alternative was the doss house, where you could get a night's sleep in literally a box for a penny, and we'll come back to that later on. So, let's go on and look at the murders. Number 5, my slide number 5. If you read about Jack the Ripper, there's lots of theories that there were more than 5 victims of Jack the Ripper. These are known as the Canonical Five, and you can see their names there. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. However, there are people that believe there were murders before the first murder, of Mary Ann Nichols, and after the murder of the last one, which was Mary Jane Kelly. There's a particular one, a lady called Martha Tambrand, who was murdered. You can make a very, very strong case that she was a victim of Jack the Ripper, but tonight, because we've only got 25 minutes or so, I'm going to stick to those 5 as the most likely murders that took place. Next slide, please. So there you are. If you Google a picture of Mary Ann Nichols, invariably you come up with a mortuary picture, but we've managed to find that one. Just a note there, at her inquest, her father said she was nearly 44 years of age, but it must be said she looked 10 years younger. Maybe Botox might have been in case. Sorry, that was uncalled. So, poor Mary, she falls into this cycle of work, poverty, destitution, living in a doss house, no regular place to sleep, and ultimately alcoholism and prostitution. Now, her body was discovered about 3:40 a.m. on Friday the 21st of August 1888 in Bucks Row. You probably won't be able to find that on the map anymore, but it's now called Durwood Street, Whitechapel. Her throat had been cut, there were 2 cuts across her throat, and the lower part of her abdomen was partly ripped open by a deep jugular wound. There were several other incisions on her body. Can we have the next picture, please? So there's poor Mary lying in her coffin in the mortuary. At the time, probably a death or a murder didn't raise too many eyes or too much public interest because of the amount of crime and violence that was going on in the East End at that time. Move on to the next one, please. The second of our victims was Dark Annie Chapman. She was, again, someone forced into prostitution. That's an earlier picture of her. And she's the first of them where a witness was apparently on the scene to witness who the Ripper might have been. Again, her throat had been cut and her abdomen had been slashed entirely open. The witness was describing the person who was nearby her at the time of her death as being a dark-haired man of shabby, genteel appearance. And then if we can move on to the next one. So there's Annie in a mortuary. So, by now, the East End is starting to wake up to the fact that there is something seriously bad going on in the East End. Women are in fear of their lives, and it's all heightened by the next event, which is slide number 10, please. If you study the history of Jack the Ripper, this is the time known as the double event. 2 women were murdered in a very short time. First was Elizabeth Stride and Eddowes. They were both killed in the early morning of Sunday, the 30th of September. Stride's body was discovered at Duffield's Yard off Berners Street, which is now Henrygue Street, Whitechapel. The cause of her death was one clear cut across the throat, which severed the main artery. Now, unlike the earlier murders, her body had not been mutilated, so people started to wonder whether this was the work of the previous murderers, or in fact, what more likely had happened, Jack, or the murderer, had been discovered or interrupted during his attack. Witnesses thought they saw Stride with a man earlier that night, but gave different descriptions. Some said that the companion was fair, others said he was dark, some said he was shabbily dressed, others said he was well dressed. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. So that's Elizabeth Stride in the mortuary. And then the next slide, please. So, Catherine Kate Eddowes. That's an earlier picture of her. It's very unusual to actually find these early pictures of the victims, but I've managed to do some digging around. Catherine Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square. If anybody knows anything about the geography of this part of London, you'll know that that's actually in the City of London. Anybody know the Houndsditch warehouse? Remember that? Anybody from that there? It's near there. Her body was discovered about 3/4 of an hour after Stride's body had been discovered. Now, if any of the Ripper victims were really unlucky, Catherine Eddowes was. She'd been arrested the night before, or the early hours of the night before, for drunkenness. She'd been locked up in a police cell, let out once she was sober, and then she fell victim to the Ripper. Again, like other victims of the Ripper, her throat had been severed and her abdomen mutilated. Now, crucially for the investigation, her left kidney had been removed. I know that's gruesome, but we'll come on to why that's important a bit later on. A local man named Joseph Laurendale had passed through the square with two friends shortly before the murder, and he described seeing a fair-haired man of shabby appearance with a woman who may well have been Catherine Eddowes. Now, the fact that two murders had taken place in a relatively short period of time led to people talking about that as the double event. Can I move on to the next slide, please? That's Catherine, and the next one after that, please. Now, we're starting to look at evidence. Part of Catherine Eddowes' bloodied apron was found in the entrance to a tenement block of flats in Goulston Street, Whitechapel. If anybody remembers, about 3 or 4 years ago, somebody claimed to exclusively prove who Jack the Ripper was because he'd managed to get part of Catherine Eddowes' apron and done some DNA testing on it, which led him to the murderer, and we'll come back to that later on. But part of her apron was found in the entrance to a tenement block of flats in Goulston Street, Whitechapel. Now, crucially, slide number 15, in exactly the same place, above the wall where the apron piece had been found, there was some graffiti, and that graffiti seemed to implicate either a Jew or the Jews. But it's unclear whether the graffiti was written by the murderer as he dropped the apron piece, or it was merely incidental. Such graffiti was commonplace in Whitechapel. Everybody had an idea graffiti was common. Now, later on, I'm going to talk about somebody called Sir Charles Warren, who was the Commissioner of Police of London. He ordered that graffiti that was written on a wall to be removed because he feared it might start anti-Semitic riots. So he ordered it to be washed away before dawn. You've got to remember at London at that time, it's a period of London when it's probably the nearest this country's ever come to a revolution. Victoria as Queen is still very, very unpopular. You've got the beginnings of socialist movements, particularly in the East End of London. You've got a great number of people who believe that the current system is so unfair that the only way to deal with it is to have an armed revolution. So he's desperate to keep a lid on this, and he will do anything to make sure there's no more riots or groups of the community are blamed for the murders. Now, I said the final murder was of Mary Kelly. We'll come on to that in a moment. Can I just do the next slide, please? So, Mary Kelly, she's unlike the other four. She's young. She's about 24, 25, something like that. She claims to have lived in France, to have been basically the kept woman of a rich Frenchman. She claims all sorts of things. She's living with a guy on and off in a place called Miller's Court. She's unlike the rest of the victims. And she's unlike the rest of the victims in that she is murdered indoors. Okay? So the Ripper has no risk of being caught or disturbed, so he's probably there 4 or 5 hours with her. Now, I warned you that the next picture is quite gruesome, so if you have a nervous disposition, please look away. So, poor Mary. She's murdered by the Ripper. Her body's discovered next day by someone who's coming round to pay the rent or collect the rent. He looks through a broken window, and the poor guy, you can imagine, is reduced to pieces. The police, when they come, they cry out to one another, "Don't look, for God's sake." She is the one that is really mutilated beyond the recognition by the Ripper. She's found at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street, Spitalfields, at 10:45 on the morning of Friday the 9th of November 1888. And like the rest of the murder victims, he's gone through the same thing. Now, if you've ever been through that part of Whitechapel and you know where the church, Spitalfields Church is, just across the road from there, I don't know if it's still there, used to be a car park, big car park, that's where Miller's Court was. Okay, so whilst the murders are taking place during September and October, people are starting to speculate on who it is. Letters are received by the press and Scotland Yard from a writer or writers purporting to be the murderer. The name of Jack the Ripper first comes up, written by someone claiming to be Jack, and it was used by the media. Now, that letter, or some of the letters, are regarded to be hoaxes and may have been written by journalists to heighten interest in the story and increase their newspaper circulation. So you immediately think of Piers Morgan and the things he gets up to, but there you are. So it's probably someone in the press. There's still speculation to this day whether the letters that come into the press are actually written by Jack or not. Okay, next slide. So whilst we're talking about witnesses, two main people come to mind. Israel Schwartz, who witnessed someone talking to Elizabeth Stride, who may well have been the murderer, and Joseph Laurendale, who we said earlier witnessed Catherine Eddowes' murder, or someone talking to her. Next slide, please. So, if you're looking for evidence on Jack the Ripper, the most quoted or most used examples are the From Hell letters. Now, there's an organisation that's set up at the time the murders start to take place called the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and it's headed by someone called George Lusk. And like anybody else that does that sort of job, he gets lots of nutters writing to him. But one of them says a letter to him, and included with it is a piece of a kidney, a left kidney. And you remember I said earlier on, Catherine Eddowes, as part of the mutilations, had had her kidney removed. There are lots of different conflicting information on that. The pathologist that looked at it said it belonged to a woman of Catherine Eddowes' age who had a ginny kidney. In other words, she was an alcoholic. Other people said it had been preserved and it was actually the work of a medical student, probably from the London hospital, or indeed the press. But that is probably one of the most significant pieces of, or clues. Okay, next slide, please. So there's the handwriting purporting to be from Jack the Ripper. You obviously can't read it, so I'll go on to the next one with the translation. It says, "From hell, Mr. Lusk saw. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you to the other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I might send you the bloody knife that took it out if you want to wait a little longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." Okay. So, whether that letter is actually genuine or, as most people suspect, a forgery, no one will ever know now. This is before the time of DNA and forensic testing, of course. Okay, can we move on? Next slide, please. So, who was Jack the Ripper? Now, I'm going to open up by saying no one will ever find out who Jack the Ripper is unless they can find a signed, verifiable confession by Jack the Ripper, or whoever Jack the Ripper was. So, the hunt will always go on. There will be lots of theories about it, but I tend to take the view that if you're trying to identify who Jack the Ripper was, you go back to the time and you look at the evidence. It's no good looking at diaries that were forged in the 1950s or 60s or whenever they were. So, in a moment, we're going to look at the three main subjects and the police that were involved in it. And the three main ones, which have stood the test of time, are Montague Lionel Druitt. I'm going to pronounce his name George Chapman. and Aaron Kosminski. If anybody wants to have a go at Severin Antonovich Kowalski, where you are, I did it, you can do. Okay, but before that, the police, you may be wondering what the police were doing in this. Well, there were several major policemen involved in this. Mentioned a guy earlier on called the Commissioner of the London Police, which was Sir Charles Warren. Now, poor Sir Charles, he actually didn't do a bad job on this, but bearing in mind all the forces that were going against him, the natural reluctance of people to identify a suspect, the crime scenes, lack of DNA, or lack of evidence really, they never caught a reliable witness. The problem with Sir Charles Warren was that he was also a high-ranking Freemason. So straight away, theories start to rise that it's a cover-up. Now, I think it was in 1988, you're all far too young to remember this, but there was a dreadful television series which featured Michael Caine, who should have been ashamed of himself to appear in it, in which Michael Caine played Inspector Abilene. We'll come on to him in a moment. And he narrowed it down to a high-ranking Freemasonry conspiracy. So you get the ridiculous notions that this is all to do with Freemasons, that Prince Eddie, who's Queen Victoria's grandson, did it because he was involved with prostitutes in the East End. In fact, that's all very well till you look at the dates when he was actually in Scotland on one night of one of the murders. Or even more stupid, the Queen's surgeon, a guy called Sir William Gull, who had had a stroke the year before and was 80 years of age. So if he managed to get back into the East End and did all of this, then he obviously was taking the monkey tablets. So all these theories are nonsense. Okay? Over time, it's always been a case that people have focused on three of them. The other police involved, I mentioned a guy called Frederick Abilene, a guy called Donald Swanson, who was in charge of the overall investigation, and crucially, somebody called Sir Melville Leslie McNaughton. All of them had their own favourites as to who they thought the Ripper was. So let's have a look at them then. Slide number 22, please. There he is, Montague Lionel John Druitt. Died in December 1888. He was born in Dorset. He was a barrister, and not a very good barrister, by the way, and he used to supplement his income by being a schoolmaster in a school in Blackheath, London, until he was dismissed shortly before he drowned himself in the River Thames. His body was found decomposing in the River Thames near Chiswick on the 31st of December 1888. Now, he was in many ways an unfortunate guy. Not a very good barrister. He was an excellent off-spin bowler by all accounts, though, because he played for Blackheath Cricket Club. His family thought he was sexually insane and that he was actually the Ripper. He believed that he was going the same way as his mother and his grandmother, who suffered from mental health problems. So he's probably suffering from depression. He dies after the death of Mary Kelly. As I said, he was found floating in the river. But there's a lot of things that actually say that it wasn't him. Whether it was him, I always thought it was him until something came to mind that made me think otherwise. But he still has these advocates as to whether or not he was the Ripper. Next slide, please. There we are. If you can grow a moustache like that, then you are not a bad bloke. That's Severin Antonovich Kowalski, alias George Chapman, born in Poland. He immigrated to the United Kingdom sometime between 1887 and 1888, and shortly before the start of the Whitechapel murders. Between 1893 and 1894, he assumes the name of George Chapman. He successively poisoned 3 of his wives and became known as the Borough Poisoner. So how someone can actually poison 3 of their partners and actually not come under suspicion until the 3rd one, well, there you are. But he did get his comeuppance. He was hanged in 1903. But at the time of the Ripper murders, he lived in Whitechapel. Chapman was Inspector Frederick Aberline's favourite suspect. However, lots of experts on the subject disagree that Chapman is a likely culprit, as he murdered his 3 wives by poison. So it's unusual for a serial killer to switch round and suddenly do what Jack the Ripper did. However, it still has his fans as to whether or not he should be regarded as a Ripper. In fact, when he was arrested for the murder, the arresting officer was congratulated by Adeline, who said, "Oh, I see you've got Jack the Ripper at last." And the final top 3, next slide please. Aaron Kosminski. Born in September 1865, dies March 1919. He's a Polish Jew who was admitted to Colney Heath Lunatic Asylum in 1891. He was named as a suspect by Sir Melville Macnaghten in his 1894 memorandum, and by Donald Swanson in handwritten comments he put in the margin of a book. Anderson wrote that a Polish Jew had been identified as the Ripper, but no prosecution was possible because the witness was also Jewish and refused to testify against a fellow Jew. Some authors are sceptical about the accuracy of this and whether or not the Kosminski mention is actually the same one. Now, you remember I mentioned earlier on that Catherine Eddowes, there was a piece of torn shawl. Back in 2014, someone got hold of what was claimed to be Catherine Eddowes' shawl minus that piece that had been torn off. And what they decided to do was to do some DNA testing to trace it back to a current descendant of Catherine Eddowes, which they did. And then they tried to do some DNA testing to prove that Kosminski had used it for, well, I won't go into details, but used it, okay? At the time, somebody was going to put that piece of shawl up for auction at the price of £2.4 million. However, Professor Sir Alex Jeffreys, the inventor of genetic fingerprinting, dismissed the claims or the results of that DNA testing as unreliable. So, we're nearly at the end now. Big finale, drum roll. Who was Jack the Ripper? I said earlier on that I thought originally, when I first started studying this, that it was Montague Lionel Druitt. I can exclusively tell you now that it was not Lewis Carroll. There is a theory that it was Lewis Carroll because what they did, they took a line of his writing and they turned it round as an anagram, and they came up with some horrendous reference to the murder. It was not Maybrick. If anybody wants to buy the Diary of Jack the Ripper, Thomas Maybrick, you are wasting your money. The reason you are wasting your money, this diary purported to be the Diary of Jack the Ripper, of a Liverpool merchant. Unfortunately, half of it had been ripped out. People, still didn't get the clue why the first part of it had been ripped out. But he also talks in detail about murder, and he uses information in there which is in the public domain. But he also talks about the murder of Mary Kelly and what had happened after she'd been mutilated. And of course, it was wrong. Okay? I'll explain if anybody wants to know afterwards what was wrong. It was wrong. It wasn't Sir William Gull, it wasn't Queen Victoria, it wasn't her grandson. So who was it? If I'm right, this guy, this is his grave. Next slide, please. The final resting place of Jack the Ripper. I believe Jack the Ripper, Aaron Kosminski, is buried in a cemetery in East Ham, Jewish cemetery in East Ham. Someone now tends the grave. That's the grave, more or less unreadable now. But I believe, for want of a cover-up, a conspiracy, They knew it was him. He was watched, apparently, and after he was watched, he never did any more, or no murders took place after that, if it really was those 5. He was someone who was found walking through the streets of Whitechapel, eating bread out of the gutter. Now, that obviously doesn't make him a violent psychopath, but the guys at the time, the police at the time, at least one of them or 2 of them thought it was him. Unless someone's got that signed confession, I think that's the final resting place of Aaron Kosminski, alias Jack the Ripper. Thank you.
Could you quickly go back to the slide of Kosminski for me? Because I don't know about you all, but he certainly looks guilty.
That's the woman's theory.
So does anybody have any questions?